In this lesson, we're going to talk about proofs. So a proof is something when you need to show why things are congruent. So in this case, we're going to be talking about triangles. So what is congruent to prove that the two triangles given are congruent? So here we are given an image and we're given 4 different given statements. Now I'm going to adjust my screen so you can see the whole thing. So it's a little small, but we'll get through it. So our first given here says angle YWX and angle YWZ are right angles. And if you look down in your statements, we have it written as number 1. And every time you write a statement, you have to explain why you said that. You can't just say, oh, this is congruent to this because I think so. Okay, it has to be proven mathematically. And one way of saying it's proven is because I gave it to you. I said that this angle here and this angle are right angles. And what do you know about right angles? They both measure 90 degrees. So we can say angle YWX is congruent to angle YWZ because all right angles are congruent. Okay, so see how we said something is congruent and we had to back up why we said it. The next thing says YW bisects, so this ray here bisects XYZ. And bisects, if you remember, takes that angle and cuts it directly in half. So we know YW bisects angle XYZ because it's given. And now we still haven't said anything was congruent. Our goal is every time we are given a given statement, if it does not have a congruency statement, you need to come up with one. So we just marked 2 angles congruent on our triangles, so we can say angle XYW is congruent to angle ZYW. And we can say that because the word bisect that we had in our given means that the angle is divided into 2 congruent angles. The next given we have is that W is the midpoint of XZ. W is the midpoint of XZ, and we know that because it's given. And midpoint, if you remember, means that it cuts that segment into 2 congruent parts. So we can say XW is congruent to ZW, just like we marked with our little dash marks. And we can say that because midpoint means it cuts, let's say, XZ into 2 congruent parts. Before we get to this last given statement, let's go over a couple things. We can say YW is congruent to YW because there's this thing called the reflexive property. It says that any line can be congruent to itself if it is shared within the 2 triangles. For number 8, we don't know what to write for the statement, but if the given says if 2 angle pairs in a triangle are congruent, then the third angle pair. So we have our right angles marked, we have this that was bisected. The only thing we have left is X and Z. And because the other 2 angles in the triangle are congruent, we can say that angle X is congruent to angle Z. Now let's go back to our 4th given, and that's this final side. XY is congruent to YZ. So you would say, because I have all my sides are congruent and all my angles are congruent, I can say that these 2 triangles, XYW and ZYW, are congruent because if all corresponding parts are congruent, then the triangles are congruent. Now this proof was so long. We proved every side congruent, every angle congruent, but it's not always going to be like that. You only need to have 3 congruent parts. Let me make my screen bigger. You only need 3 congruent parts. So because we only need that, we have to angle side, angle, angle, angle side, or HL. So the properties are the congruency postulates that we talked about last week. So here we're given AD, our first given is AD is congruent to CD. And the reason we know that is because it's one of our given statements. So let's mark it on our image. AD is congruent to DC. And then since it is a congruency statement, it has this congruency symbol in it, then you move on. You already have what you were looking for. The second congruency statement is AB is congruent to BC. And we know that, again, because it's given. And if we mark that on our picture, it's a congruency statement, therefore we can move on. But at this point, our goal is to prove that these two triangles are congruent, but you need 3 congruency statements. And at this point, we only have 2. If you run out of givens and you still are looking for one more congruency statement, always look for reflexive or vertical angles. And in this case, DB is a reflexive side. So you could say DB is congruent to DB. And that's because of the reflexive property. Now, how did we prove these congruent? We have the last step is always what you are trying to prove. So you would copy down this congruency statement, triangle ABD is congruent to triangle CBD, and we can say that the triangles are congruent by, let's see, we always look at just one triangle. So we're just going to look at this one here, and we're going to see what we had marked. We marked a side, we marked a side, and we marked a side. So side, side, side. Here's another one. So we have given angle TLR is congruent to angle SLR. And we know that because it's given. TLR is congruent to SLR. We have a congruency statement. We can move on. Our second given is L is the midpoint of TS. And we know that because it's given. L is the midpoint of TS. Now that is not a congruency statement, so you have to look at your image and show that this point L is the midpoint of TS. What happened? Well, what happened is you have 2 pieces of information that are now the same length. So you could say TL is congruent to SL. And you can say that because midpoint means it cut TS into 2 congruent parts. Now, we are out of givens. We used this one and we used that one. But we only have 2 congruency statements. So we always look for reflexive or vertical angles. In this case, we have a reflexive side. So your next step, you would say L is congruent to RL, and that's because of the reflexive property. Now, how did you prove these congruent? We have the last step is our prove. We write the 2 triangles are congruent, and here we said a side, an angle, and a side were congruent. Those are our 3 congruency statements. So you look at your picture. Since the 2 sides are forming the angle, you would say that the triangles are congruent by side, angle, side. I'm going to skip this one and go to this one because I only have so much time to make my video. So we're going to just pick and choose. So the other ones that I skip, I want you to try on your own. Here we have one, it just has one given. It says M is the midpoint of AD and CB. Now, M is the midpoint of AD is technically one given. You have to write a second one saying M is also the midpoint of CB. So we have one given and we have two givens. So you have to write these separately. So you would say M is the midpoint of AD, and you know that because it's given. So you go over to your image, find AD, and show that M is the midpoint. So what you just drew is you said that AM is congruent to DM. And the reason behind that is a midpoint cuts AD into two congruent parts. Now that's only half of the given. The other given says that M is the midpoint of CB. And the reason you know that is it's given as well. So you find CB and you show that M is the midpoint. So here you can say CM is congruent to BM. And the reason behind that is a midpoint cuts CB into two congruent parts. Now we're out of givens. We used both of those. So what we have to look for is a reflexive side or vertical angles. In this case, we don't have a reflexive side. These triangles are not next to each other, but they are forming a vertical angle. So those two straight lines that intersect, those form vertical angles. So you can say angle AMC is congruent to angle DMB because of vertical angles. Now this last step is always the proof. So we numbered them here. So we would say triangle AMC is congruent to triangle BMD because the triangles are congruent by, and you have to look back at your picture. So you remember, you always look at one side. You have a side, an angle, and a side. And again, the sides form that angle. So you would say they're congruent by side, angle, side. The rest of these I want you to try on your own. If you have any questions, please come to me for questions. Have a good day.